So what I like to do is read the required before I start doing the work. So in brief exercise 3-7, 1, it says determine the amount of underapplied or overapplied manufacturing overhead for the period. And then 2, assuming the entire amount of the underapplied or overapplied overhead is closed out to cost of goods sold, what would be the effect of the underapplied or overapplied overhead on the company's gross margin for the period? So let's do number 1. Now the first place that I'll start is in this manufacturing overhead account, and I need to know what all of the actual manufacturing overhead is. So remember, this was indirect labor, indirect materials, and all other manufacturing costs aside from direct materials or direct labor that were involved with making our product for the period. So in the question it says the company incurred actual total manufacturing overhead of $315. So all of our actual go on the debit side. Now the second step is I have to figure out what I allocated. So this is going to be called applied. So throughout the year, I was working on jobs, and for each job I was allocating direct materials, direct labor, and then manufacturing overhead, which is this number here. But the problem is that I didn't know what the actual amount was. I actually won't know the actual amount until the end of the year. So in order to work around that, because the option is allocate nothing or guess, I'm going to do a guess. So this technique that I'm showing you is a way to have a more accurate guess. And so the first thing that we need to do is calculate a predetermined overhead rate, or POR. And you do this at the beginning of the year. So what someone would do is come up with their estimated total manufacturing costs. So they're going to guess this number here. Remember, they don't know it because they're doing it at the beginning of the year, and this number comes up at the end of the year. And then we're going to divide that by a cost driver. Let me move it down here. So it's dividing by some sort of cost driver, and I'll call it estimated cost driver. So when I say cost driver, I'm talking about activity. So if our company was making a product, and it's really easy to measure direct labor, especially if these are being made by individual employees, then we could technically estimate what the total direct labor is, and then maybe allocate our manufacturing overhead based off of that. Another way you could look at it is off of machine hours. So if you have your process automated and your product is being made by machines, then it might make more sense to use machine hours to allocate your overhead. What I've also seen before too is doing it off of a direct labor cost. So then you'd end up with a percentage, or machine costs, you'd end up with a percentage. So we just have to read each question to see what it tells us to do. Now here it said Osborne Manufacturing uses a predetermined overhead rate of $28.20 per direct labor hour. Now they calculated this because they estimated 12,000 direct labor hours. So they did this at the beginning of the year. So I'll put 12,000 on the bottom. And then on the top was their estimated manufacturing overhead. So that's 338,400. So just remember, it's always a dollar amount on the top and activity on the bottom. And I'll just say direct labor hours. at the beginning of the year, they said, we think our manufacturing overhead account is going to be $338,400. And we think all of the products that we make, it's going to be 12,000 direct labor hours. So if I take the 338,400 and divide that by 12,000, that gives me the 2820 that you see right here. Okay, so in some questions they'll make us calculate this, and other questions they'll just give us this answer. So that's just step one. Now the next step is to find out how many actual direct labor hours there were. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my predetermined overhead rate and then I'm going to multiply it by the actual direct labor hours. So if we were doing this by job, you would do this for every single job. You'd see how many hours it was for job 1, and then you'd allocate that out by $28.20. Then you'd figure out how many direct labor hours was in job 2, and then you'd allocate that out at $28.20. But we're just happening to do this all at once. So in the question it says that there's 11,500 total direct labor hours during the period. So that's actual. So I'm going to do 11,500. Oops. So if we take 2820 times by the actual, which is 11,500, then that's going to give us our total applied overhead. So 2820 times 11,500 gives me 324,000. Okay, and let me just put this up here like actual direct labor hours. Ugh. Direct labor hours. I don't know why my Excel spreadsheet is not cooperating with me, but I'm going to try and fix this one more time, and if not, I'm going to move on. There we go. And I want all of this to be Arial 12. Okay. And now this one is my applied manufacturing overhead. Okay, so just remember, this is my predetermined overhead. Multiply it by your actual cost driver for the job, and then that gives you the applied manufacturing overhead that we're going to allocate to the job. So now I'm going to put that number right in here, 324,300. So now I can see that I have 315 over here, and I have applied 324,300. So what we're saying is we've actually allocated too much overhead to our jobs because our actual only ended up being 315. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 324,300 minus 315,000, and that tells me how much. It's 9,300. So I'll just say overapplied. Now, even though it didn't ask me to do the journal entry, I'll do the journal entry for you anyways, just so we can complete this question. So I need this to be 0 at the end. So what we'll end up doing is a journal entry for the 9,300. So then 9,300 minus 9,300 is 0. So do you see how I put a debit to manufacturing overhead? I'm just going to copy that, 9,300. And then this might feel weird to you, but now we have to decrease our cost of goods sold. By 9,300. So that's recording the over-applied manufacturing overhead. So now when we're thinking about what would be the effect of the under-applied or over-applied on the company's gross margin for the period. So what you saw me do here was credit this account, so it's actually increasing the gross profit. Now I can show you. If you don't believe me, let's just make this up. Make this up. Let's pretend that our sales was 100,000. Okay, so this is before the adjustment. And now I'm going to compare it to after the adjustment, 100,000. And let's just pretend our cost of goods sold was 50,000 before the adjustment. So then our gross margin is 100,000 minus 50. So our gross margin is 50%. Okay, so if I post this 9,300 to cost of goods sold, that's going to decrease the cost of goods sold number. So I'm going to go 50,000 minus the 9,300. So in this case, once I post this overhead that I overapplied, I'll end up with a higher gross margin. So see how that's higher? So before it was 50 and after it's now 59. If it was underapplied, it would be the opposite. So sometimes when it asks me a question like this and I can't quite understand it, I'll make up a scenario, fill in my own numbers, so then I can prove to myself that gross margin did go up. Okay, and now we're done talking about everything you need to know about manufacturing overhead.